And ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage the moderator of the next session, Josh Lipsky, Senior Director of the GeoEconomics Center of the Atlantic Council.
Thank you, Minister, for that wonderful conversation. And as we do this stage change, we'll get ready, and in a moment, I'll welcome up my distinguished panel. I want to thank everyone for being part of this conversation so far today. And it really has been, I think, as everyone has seen, what we tried to construct conceptually from this day was an arc, starting with this coercive tools, the coercive measures, and moving across the day into elements of traditional economic thinking, what some call positive economic statecraft, trade issues, development aid, so that by the end of the day, when you think of the sessions and you look at the report I hope you have in your hands that everyone got when they came in, you have a sense that economic statecraft is not negative or positive, but simply the way that governments have to function in this new era. And it made sense to us doing this that we could not have that conversation, and I think if you just listen to that, what we just heard, you have to recognize without hearing from the private sector. And so I welcome up our distinguished panel. Please join me on stage and I'll introduce you. Christian Tüving, CEO of Deutsche Bank, and Michael Schoellhorn, CEO, Airbus Defense and Space. Christian, we'll have you right here, close to me. And then Michael and Candace. Candace Kelly, Chief Legal Officer of Stellar Development Foundation, and Nils Aldag, CEO of SunFire. So we don't have a lot of time, and we have a wonderful panel, and I want to get right to it. Mr. Tüving, I just have to start with a reaction to what we heard from the minister on the German economy specifically. Before we get into the broader themes of the conference and statecraft, Julia brought up these questions about Germany being, quote unquote, the sick man of Europe. This is something that is talked about a lot in Washington. There's a lot of information about what is happening in the German economy. Your perspective?
Well, I was public already. I think it's wrong to say that Germany at this point in time is the sick man of Europe. A lot of people compare the situation with the starting of the 2000s when we had the Agenda 2010. We had a completely different structure at that point in time. If you just look at numbers of unemployment and so on, we were in a different condition. So I wouldn't call ourselves the sick man of Europe. And by the way, I can see that not only in banking, but for the overall economy. It's also dangerous to do that because 50% of the economy is sentiment. So we have a tendency to talk ourselves down where others would be actually quite happy to still be in such an economy like we are. But I think the minister said something very important. He said, look, we call it in Deutsche Bank also, we enjoyed the golden decade. China, gas, and he forgot one thing. Financing for zero. It was nothing. It cost nothing. So it was like a kid in a candy shop. And if you are too long in a candy shop, something happens with you. So in this regard, I think we have to face the reality that the foundation of, or part of the foundation why we enjoyed that decade is not coming back, at least not for the next 10 years. And that means if we don't go for structural reforms now, we will become the sick man of Europe. And I think it's our joint responsibility and accountability to avoid that situation. Now, what we need to do, I think we are all clear. I mean, here we have people from the real industrial corporate industries. We don't need to talk about energy prices. But it's not only the energy price now, it's in particular how people can plan for the next 5 or 10 years on the energy front. We need to talk about infrastructure. I think the most important, and therefore we talked about the IRA in the interview before, it is not about the subsidies in the US. It is the simpleness of how the subsidy can be asked for. If I go into the boardroom of Deutsche Bank and I ask my supervisory, now Sigmar is not here, for a certain investment, and I can tell him that that investment is turned profitable in 3 years in the US, but only in 5 or 6 years in Europe. Well, guess what we decide? It's the simplicity, the speed, what is behind the IRA. So bureaucracy and deregulation is a key item for the overall European economy. And the fifth part is, in my view, that finally we need to move for a real European Union. And again, I'm not only saying that as a banker, but I'm saying that for the whole industry. When you talk to the telecom industry, if you talk to other industries, we don't have a real European Union and one market for service industries. We simply don't have it. Deutsche Bank is in 14 European countries, and I can tell you I have 14 different regulations when it comes to money laundering, when it comes to know your clients. And that means I'm not efficient and I can't really use my home market, which is at the doorstep of Deutsche Bank, as one home market. That's what the US is not understanding. Then there is a last point, and I think, again, the minister said that. And I think it is potentially one of the most important, next to these 4 or 5 items I said before, and that's our attitude. I think I've seen this summer so many international corporate CEOs like never before. And the concern is not about German innovation, German technology, German expertise, skills. The concern is about our attitude to work. How can it be that in a situation where we are not growing, we are seriously talking about a 4-day week in Germany with the same payment? I have done the math for Deutsche Bank. Well, surprisingly, it doesn't work. I'm sure everybody here has done the math for it won't work. And if so, it's a miracle. We need to think about that, what we enjoyed over the last 10 years, and therefore I started with this golden decade. If we don't turn our attitude to work harder again, then actually the foreign investors will actually really start to rethink about their investments into Germany. We are seen as a country with great standards, but there is a bit of laziness in the system. If we don't get it out, then we seriously get a problem, and therefore I think the term attitude is really important.
A clear message. Thank you. So, Michael, I'm going to come to you in a moment to respond to that and get your take from the industrial side. But one follow-up question broadly on the themes of this conference about sanctions. We heard from practitioners in the beginning this morning, those who had implemented sanctions from the US and the UK and the EU. You, as one of the largest banks in the world, are the implementers, compliers of these sanctions. And I wonder over the past 18 months, lessons learned on compliance and implementation, and also the message you would like to deliver back to those, many of whom are sitting in this room, who design sanctions from the government side.
Well, first of all, let me say that, and not a lot of people will expect that from me, but the sanctions were necessary. I think we, as the Western Alliance, have to defend our values like democracy, liberty, freedom, and therefore we have to play our part as banks in order to help to make sure that this aggressive war comes to an end. And therefore, there is no issue with the sanctions. Now, when it comes to the applications of the sanctions, I mean, there is no blueprint for anybody. We in Deutsche Bank, to be honest, had to implement more than 3,000 individual sanctions. Yeah. That's quite a lot. It's not which you do from a Sunday night to a Monday morning. You need to train your people. There are some issues which are very complex, which we also don't understand immediately, so there must be consultations. But I think it's all understandable, and I would say the whole banking industry tries to do everything to be absolutely in compliance, and I think we have done a good job, but at the end of the day, regulators will decide. There is one wish I have, that while we have such an allied stance from the Western world to Russia, it would be fantastic to have more standards or sanctions which are potentially even better coordinated between the countries. If you think about the different standards from the UK, US versus EU, that's quite a bit, and therefore, again, it's sometimes very complicated and complex. But again, this is a wish we have for the future, and I don't want to criticize here because, again, we came into a situation in February 2022 where there is no blueprint, and I think we have to be good citizens in order to comply.
Thank you for that, and that really is one of our missions here at the conference, to start developing a blueprint, or at least a framework, to have the conversation, because the coordination is key. Michael, I want to turn to you, your perspective from the industrial side, from Airbus side, on what we just heard on some of the factors in the German economy. But I also wanted to ask you about something Minister Habeck said about outbound investment screening. That struck me as something that would be key to a company like Airbus, a company that builds and operates all over the world, including in China. So your response on both of those fronts.
That's a loaded question. There's many questions in one, but I give it a shot. Maybe I would start, I feel like I want to add one fourth point to what you added to what the minister said. The fourth point I think that was not mentioned was free security, or cheap security based on free riding on the German side. That provided for a lot of the advantages. But back to your question. So the geopolitical situation for Airbus, as for any other company, is very complex, and I guess there's a lot of pros here in the room, so I don't need to belabor much what that is, with the US-China rivalry, with a lot of middle powers around that, with a situation that has affected us first through COVID, then through the war and the sanctions, very much on the commercial aircraft side. Has added to an already difficult supply chain situation. Many of the critical raw materials for aviation come from countries that are sanctioned now, so the whole world was scrambling to find ways around that and find new sources and all of that, so it showed to a degree also a lack of resilience to begin with. We're sort of coping with that, that's all working, and on the defense side, that obviously, as people would assume, has a sort of a positive effect in that feeling of insecurity, not only Europe, but also in the world. In Asia, many countries around China in Asia feel threatened, are nervous about the aggressive stance of China. That has increased their defense spending, and many times some countries don't want to side with either the US or China, so they use the European vendor, if you will. So that's all helping us. So there's a sort of built-in resilience in the company that helps to navigate these things. When it comes to Europe, it gets far more difficult. Many things Christian has mentioned already. When it comes to dealing with sanctions, obviously we stand 100% behind what was decided. The implementation of the sanctions, and let alone the last sanction package, has triggered such a bureaucracy. I mean, you have to go to a degree of minutia that is killing small companies. So it's not a lack of willingness to support that. It's more the clarity, the simplicity, the bureaucracy that's associated with that. And I don't have a silver bullet and a proposal how to make that very simple, but it's just a fact of life. Touching on your, well, maybe I should also add that as a company that also is active in defense and is sort of at the core of European collaboration and is many times mentioned as the Airbus of such and such, of IT or whatever, the Airbus of defense is very difficult. Conventional wisdom would say after Ukraine, as a wake-up call, one would think or would have thought or would have hoped that Europe gets our act together in terms of upping our game in defense, overcoming the fragmentation that we have, overcoming the lack of efficiency in the system. The opposite is happening. We're falling back into national trends more and more. The Franco-German collaboration is maybe at a low point, at least currently in my assessment. And some of the projects that we also stand for are maybe the last glimpses of hope in terms of, you know, it can be done better. That's not good. That's weakening not only the companies, but I think it's weakening Europe. To your last question in the many of China and investing and what does that do? And like many or most, I would say, European companies, we don't advocate for a decoupling. We want to de-risk, definitely. De-risking means looking at supply chain and doing something that I would summarize as China plus one. In the case that we have a Chinese source, we want at least one more somewhere else. Sometimes we also deliberately leave China and provide more resilience through doing that, but mostly it's adding, nearshoring, friendshoring. Aviation is a very global business, so you cannot neglect that China has become the biggest market. So it would be shooting oneself in the foot to just say, okay, we leave that market to others. By the way, the Americans have no intentions of leaving that market. The one thing that we try to pay attention to is if push came to shove and there was a situation, let's say, around Taiwan that could lead to blockage, sanctions, and all kinds of difficulties, and the Chinese business would fall away, we would have to be in a position that this is not killing the company. And to lose maybe a simplistic picture, it would feel like losing a finger, but not losing half of your body or a vital organ. And this is actually very much what we're doing. What we're doing in China sounds quite exposed with final assembly lines in China on the commercial side, but they are just covering the Chinese demand. And of the value chain affected by that, they only cover 8% of what we do of an aircraft. So 92% is in Europe or the US. But the 8% enable us to open and tap into the Chinese market, and that makes us stronger.
Thank you. You answered all of the questions, and I appreciate that. And there were a lot in there.
I was trying.
So just, so I hear you right and understand you're actively assessing the exposure, and there's contingency planning going on for worst case scenarios, which completely makes sense and useful I think for everyone to hear that, especially here in Berlin. One quick follow-up before I go to Candace. We talked a lot about China in that part of your answer, not as much about the US. And I wonder, when you hear terms, we'll hear from Ambassador Tai in just a few minutes, like friendshoring, and no company, few aerospace companies have more global footprint than Airbus. What does that mean to you?
I think it depends very much on the business. When it's the defense business, even without the US invitation, there is a consideration of, call it friendshoring or call it targeted sourcing. With our customers, at least in Europe, they have an expectation of where the main components come from. Now, as we all know, that gets more complex as you move up the tier chain, and at the tier 6 level, then many things do end somewhere in a country that maybe is not intended on the list. When it comes to the commercial business, I think you have to look at the industry. When it's a global industry, and the US is not behaving indifferently in that regard, you need to play it globally. And I come back to what I tried to explain before. We try to do it smartly. We try to, excuse the French, the shit hit the fan, we don't die. We move on.
Yeah. Well, thank you for being so blunt. That's the first time that's word's been used in the Transatlantic Forum. Maybe not the last. Candace, I want to turn to you because we've spent a lot of time this morning, understandably, talking about Russia. Cost to Russia, sanctions effectiveness on Russia. We had a breakout session on Ukraine, and I wanted to bring Ukraine to the main stage, which is why you're here. You are actively operating in Ukraine as a company trying to build payment systems, and I think it's useful to hear about that and hear about some of the challenges you're going through in that process.
Sure, and I'm going to start by just a little background on who we are, because I don't think the Stellar Development Foundation is quite the household name as some of the other esteemed panelists here. So we are a foundation based in the United States. We're a nonprofit organization, and our mission is to create equitable access to the global financial system. We do that by supporting the Stellar ecosystem, which is the ecosystem of builders and developers who are building on the Stellar network, which is an open public blockchain network. And we do that, we have 3 pillars of what our work is. So we give grants and technical support, we contribute to the open source code base of the network, and we engage in policy and thought leadership conversations like the one today. So with respect to Ukraine, and I want to make it very clear, given how I just described, we are not a service provider. We are not building. This story that I'm about to tell you is about Ukrainians building solutions for themselves with a little bit of advice from some folks who know the technology. So we are technology advisors in this story. And I think that's really important, particularly as you point out. We're in the arc of the day, right? And this is a story about the resilience and really fascinating determination of the Ukrainian people. So we met with President Zelensky pre-war in Silicon Valley when he came to visit and learned about his very incredible leadership and forward thinking on digitalization, and his Ministry of Digital Transformation folks were there as well. And we learned about DIA, which is their app for government services, their IDs, their passports, their business registrations, moving towards a paperless world. And so the next obvious step is moving towards a cashless world and tokenizing the hryvnia and being able to use the power of the blockchain, the transparency and openness of the blockchain. And that also was very much aligned with President Zelensky's attack on corruption in Ukraine. So between that conversation, after that conversation, we really began a very close relationship with the Ministry of Digital Transformation, with some of the banks, the National Bank of Ukraine, and there was a pilot that Tascom Bank did last year, which led to what's happening right now, which is it's not our product, it's not our launch, so I think imminently, I won't give any timeline, but a fast payments network for Ukraine that is built on the Stellar network. And so it's very exciting, and I think it's something that's very exciting for the people of Ukraine in terms of a fast and efficient network. But as we are also working with the UN on aid, already delivering aid using the Stellar network to internally displaced Ukrainians, the reconstruction is going to be immense, and the amount of money that's going to be deployed is going to be significant. So whether you're in humanitarian aid or reconstruction, or in a country that is, has been really pulling away from this reputation and history with corruption issues, having a transparent, accountable network that's fast and is critical to making that happen. And so we're really excited to see whenever it actually grows out. But it's called the Transparency Network. I should have mentioned that. And it again is it's the Independent Association of the Banks of Ukraine and another technology provider, both Ukrainians. And so we are really honored to be a part of contributing to that process.
Thank you. Thank you for that, an important clarification on the helping advise versus building. So thank you. Nils, I want to turn to you. We've talked about sanctions. We've talked about export controls. We've talked about investment screening. But the big one out there is really industrial policy that has grown in the US, that has grown in Europe, that has become part of whatever form of positive or negative, but part of the broader idea of economic statecraft and geoeconomics in the few years. And you're at the center of this in your company, what you do with hydrogen, green transition. And I wonder your perspective dealing with this competition, private sector versus government funding, government support of this kind of transition.
Yeah. So maybe also just 10 seconds on what we do. SunFire is a manufacturer of industrial electrolyzers, so big industrial devices that split water into hydrogen and oxygen using renewable electricity. We're one of the leading companies in the Western world, and we serve some of the biggest refineries, steel plants, energy companies in Germany, for example, RWE, Uniper, and a couple of other big companies. A second quick point I wanted to make to what has been said before is that there is a bit of a deindustrialization blues, and I think this hydrogen story is a story of optimism. So within SunFire, we always say for once, it's less about German angst, and it's more about German optimism coming from Eastern Germany, which I think is a great story, and we also need those real stories to be scaled up in order not to get into this pessimistic down cycle thing that I sometimes feel is taking place a bit. So we hope that we can contribute with our story to something which fits enormously well with the competencies that we have within Germany and Europe, which is mechanical engineering, plant engineering, and also the networks of companies, of suppliers that work with big OEMs and so on. So I think it's really a fantastic future topic with a lot of optimism attached to it. Now, when I look at the tender processes I'm engaged in, so at the big projects that I'm engaged in, I compete typically with 2-3 European companies and always with at least one US and at least one Chinese companies, and it's actually getting more Chinese companies. If I look at my product and what I can do today or how I can differentiate, then that's efficiency, it's costs, and there is a couple of levers how I can influence those, but they are the same for my US and also my Chinese competition. And despite those levers being relatively similar, I see that there seems to be a certain advantage for especially the Chinese competition. And that has a lot to do with 2 points. One is scale. So whoever scales up the fastest goes down the cost reduction curve the quickest and will take over the market. That's a fact. So the longer we take to implement industrial policy, regulation, things that enable my customers to have a business case, the longer it takes me to get to the volumes that I need in order to bring my costs down. And since that's really the absolute key factor in this equation, I think that's a point where we should be substantially faster, and I think Robert Habeck said that in his speech as well. It's about speed, or someone said it. It's about speed, and we've had a head start in the regulatory space. We haven't made the best out of it. That's my first point. The second one is it's clear that with renewable energies or renewable energy technologies, in the beginning they are more expensive than their fossil alternatives. So upscaling doesn't function without some kind of initial support. It's also clear that it can't last forever, and we have to bring the costs down and become competitive with traditional technologies. But in the beginning, we need this kind of support mechanisms, the support schemes, in order to get the first projects going. And final word on that. When I see what I see in Europe is we're spending an incredible amount of money now to enable those business cases and to reduce CO2 emissions. So we're doing something good for the planet. But when I see that the first big billion-euro subsidized projects are going into the hands of non-European companies or suppliers in the second or third level, I think that's something which will be difficult to argue to the population in Germany and also in Europe. So I think we need industrial policy just to get this whole thing up and to get the volumes and be competitive against what happens in China and also in the US. And we need to do it smart, so that it's not just about CO2 emission reductions, but actually also about the jobs, the people, the story that I started with, the European or German optimism story that we have in front of us in the hydrogen space.
Thank you for that. I think that's such an important point. We think so much about the inputs on industrial policy, subsidies, what kind of businesses will be encouraged, and not nearly enough about then who will be hired, subcontracted, et cetera. So we're missing a huge part of this if we're going to pursue those policies, which is a separate conversation. But if we're going to do them, you have to think through them in a much smarter way. So I appreciate that. We're running low on time, and I want to get to one or two audience questions. But before I do that, a question for all of you, which is really why we did this session today. You know, Fred Kemp, the president and CEO of the Atlantic Council, said in the beginning that for a long time, for decades, the security and the economic pillars of the US and European relationship largely could operate on separate tracks. You have a security relationship and bilateral trade and financial relationship between the US and Europe. That's changed. And so my question to each of you, and I'll go down the line, is how much do you and your companies think about geopolitics every day? And Christian, I'll start with you.
Well, a lot, obviously, and I remember when we, last year in March 2022, when we came out with the so-called Capital Markets Day or Investor Day, actually we started from the geopolitical side, and we said, how is the world changing? And that geopolitical analysis is then clearly having an impact on our business setup, on our risk decisions, on our capital allocation, but also at the end of the day, always thinking, what does it mean for our clients on the corporate side, on the private side? I do believe that this, what we are experiencing right now, again, as I said before, is not something for the next 2 or 3 years. It's a new decade. It's a new era. And that also means that our advisory to our clients, be it on the private or corporate side, is changing dramatically. The number of discussions we have with corporates realigning their sourcing, realigning their networks is triple, is quadruple of that what we have seen before. So we need to take that into account.
Thank you. Michael?
Well, short answer would be, I don't know, 99% every day, but to give it a bit more color, as I said, aviation is a global industry, and Airbus is a very political company, so we've always spent quite a bit of time discussing and analyzing geopolitics. I would say, maybe in my other function as the representative of BDLI, of the German Aviation Association, or Industry Association, I think we used to believe in the other way, economy drives geopolitics, Wandel durch Handel, maybe in a very simplified way, and I know I'm simplifying too much, but I think that logic has reversed. I think geopolitics drives the economy these days, and everybody needs to think about it very much.
Candace?
So digital assets are obviously very much intermingled with the geopolitical landscape, whether you're talking about existing assets, the fear of assets, the promise of digital assets. It is here, and it is part of the geopolitical landscape as the digital assets are. And so whether we are addressing issues with policy and lawmakers of how digital assets may or may not help evade sanctions, or how you can actually comply with AML CFT obligations with the proper use of digital assets, or we're talking about private stablecoins and whether or not a digital dollar is something that is a helpful soft power tool for supporting the US dollar globally. It's something that, while it doesn't actually change the way the foundation does our work, because any one of those assets could be issued on the network, and the foundation's role is not to pick winners and losers, but it does inform the conversations that we have and how we can engage with policymakers, lawmakers, to make sure that we are helping do our part as industry to help understand the technology so we can get to a place where we have smart regulation to make sure that all of the risks that people fear are minimized and that we can get the benefit of the technology.
Thank you, and thanks for bringing up the phrase digital dollar, which was brought up in one of our breakout sessions and is a geopolitical as much as a financial issue. Nils.
Very simple and short. I founded my company with 2 friends in the living room of an apartment in Berlin, so the walls were relatively narrow, and considering or thinking back of those times, it actually plays a pretty significant role today. And it's mostly driven actually by the big parties that are looking to us to purchase equipment, who look at our supply chains, the way we interact with people in the world. So short answer, it does play a significantly larger role than it probably would have played 5 years ago.
Thank you. I want to turn to a few audience questions. We'll take 2 or 3. Are there hands up? I see one back here. We'll run you a microphone.
Thank you. My name is Ulrich Sante. I'm a former member of the German Foreign Service and now the Vice Chairman of the Landesbank Baden-Württemberg. The question that I have is the following. We're talking these days a lot about the financial needs that we have in order to implement the transition policies that we generated ourselves. And I'm talking obviously about energy, I'm talking about mobility, and I'm talking on the other hand about the digitalization and the stretch that is enlarging between us and others with regard to our ability to be at the vanguardia, as the Spanish say, in the front line of digitalization in the future. What we're not talking about that much are the financial needs of our Mittelstand. 95% of our companies in Germany are Mittelstands companies, and they have to implement on a number of policies that the war of Russia against Ukraine, for example, initiated, and that is de-risking and diversifying. Now, a lot of money is necessary for that. There is another huge amount of money that is necessary, and that is to enable these companies to compete when tenders are given out by mainly countries these days of the global south and huge infrastructure projects. And the question is, are German companies well equipped? Are they well situated in the international market these days in order to enable our Mittelstand and other companies to participate in that gigantic race? My question obviously is directed more or less directly to Christian Sewing, who may be dealing with these questions these days. My question specifically is our financial environment sufficiently coherent? Are we strong enough? Do we have enough firepower? What do we do? What do we need to do beyond strengthening our capital market and our European capital market in particular, in order to enable us to be a player in that big game that is just beginning with regard to the systemic, how should I say, relationship between China and the United States?
I think Christian knew that question was directed to him, so over to you.
Well, first of all, regards to Rainer Neske. Look, you gave your answer yourself, actually, because it was not only a question, but we will not be able to do all the investments without the capital markets union in Europe. And to put it even more bluntly, the Green Deal in Europe will not happen without an integrated capital markets. Will not happen. Impossible. And why? The EU itself is saying that we need 600 billion of net investments per year until 2050 to come to net zero. Think about the number, 600 billion net investments per year. For the right reasons, we discussed for long the special budget of 100 billion for defense, and Michael will tell us now it's not enough at all. So can you imagine how this is financed? We have robust banks. I think the European banks all did their homework. I'm not worried about that at all, but we don't have the financial capacity to finance that. Be it for the large corporates, be it for what you say, the mid-cap corporates. 86% of lending in Germany is coming from the banks, 14% only via the capital markets. It's exactly the other way around in the US. So if we don't achieve the capital markets union, you have an absolutely fair point, and therefore I'm repeating this message every day, every week, and I will not stop, also for those people who like me to stop. Without this capital markets union, Europe will not grow and the prosperity of Europe will decrease.
So I'm going to actually have that be the last word since we're out of time and we want to get to our next session. Please join me in thanking our fantastic panel here.